Hi guys, it's Kendra from Crafty Kendra, and today I'm going to show you how to make this card. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is bring in our card base, and our card base is Island Indigo. It was cut at 8.5 by 5.5, scored at 4 1/4 to make a standard size card. We're going to turn it so that our fold is at the top. Featured Harvest Designer Series paper. I'm going to flip it over, attach some snail to the back, and bring back in our card base. I'm going to center this. We're going to go ahead and set this aside. Next we're going to bring in a 5.5 by 1 inch piece of Lucky Limeade. Now we're going to bring in our paper piercing mat and one of the templates from our Essentials paper piercing hack. And what we're going to do is we're just going to line up and center the dots onto this piece, lining up the bottom edge of our paper with this black line here. Make sure I can show you the edge. Actually, I'm going to bring it down just a little bit more so that the top of these little tiny ticks, you'll see them right there, those tiny little ticks, those are going to line up with the bottom of our paper. Alright, now I'm going to grab my paper piercer. And starting at the end, what we're going to do is we're going to pierce one hole, skip a hole, and then pierce again. We're going to move over a line, pierce the center one, then we're going to move down a line and pierce those two. So basically what we're doing is we're alternating each row from piercing 2 to piercing 1. So we're basically making little X's. The easiest way I found to do it is just to move your nail along with it. That way you know where you ended. You want to make sure that you're not moving your mat as you pierce. I do tend to do that on extensive piercing, so make sure you're holding your mat in place, double checking. If you get off center just a little bit, just adjust. It doesn't have to be perfect. Alright. So you end up with this nice piercing there. That just gives it some nice texture. I'm going to go ahead and move all of our piercing materials out of the way. Put my little sleeve back on my needle. Back into its container. Gonna bring in the Hello You stamp from the retired Hello You stamp set. Going to flip it over and I'm going to ink it up in Early Espresso. Gonna bring in my Stampin' and my clear sheet. Just gonna line up the clear paper, or plastic, I'm sorry, in my Stampin' crook, stamp down, and then I'm going to bring back in my ink. I closed it, got a little ahead of myself. Go ahead and re-ink my stamp, set it down. Going to line up my greeting where I want it. Bring the Stampin' jig to the plastic, remove the plastic, stamp with my stamp, and there I have my image. right where I want it. Close up my ink pad, move everything out of the way. I'm going to flip this over and add a strip of snail to it. I'm going to add the snail over my holes, which will make the holes close up a little, but you still get the nice little piercing. Let's zoom in. Then I'm going to bring in another piece of the Orchard Harvest Designer Series paper, and it's actually the back of the piece that we put onto the paper. This piece measured 4 inches by 5 1/4. This piece measures 5 1/2 by 1/2 inch. We're going to go ahead and put snail on the back, so on the striped side. Going to bring in the piece that we just did, and I love my grid paper for this fact that I can line it up so that the solid line, there's a 1/4 of an inch between my paper and the solid line. So all I do is make sure that my green piece is lined up against that 1/4 mark, line my extra piece up on the solid line, line up the edges, then I get a nice little 1/4 inch border. I do have a little excess on this one end. Just going to trim that off. Okay. Now I will bring in my card base with the flap towards the bottom. Going to line it up about a 1/2 inch from the bottom of the card. And you can line it up on the lines if you want it to be perfect. I don't require it to be perfect. Just going to press it down. I'm going to set this aside. I'm going to bring in a scratch piece of Very Vanilla. And my basic black ink pad. Also going to bring in my Raspberry Ripple, along with one of the apples and the mason jar from the Perfectly Preserved stamp set. I'm going to go ahead and ink up my apple and the Raspberry Ripple. Going to stamp it once, and then I'm going to stamp it again, not overlapping but close. And you'll notice that I made sure that I left a gap around it, and that's because I'm going to take these exact same apples, and all I did was I put it on Post-it paper so it has a sticky. Going to lay it down on top of the bottom apple, and then I'm going to ink up my jar, bring in my ink pad, my Stampin' jig, sorry, line it up in the crook, stamp down, and I'll wash this off later. So now I know exactly where I want to stamp my mason jar. And the reason why I inked over one, well I put the Post-it on one and not the other, is because I want to make sure that it has depth. So I want to cover up this bottom line so it looks like the apple's in front of it. But this one line on the jar is a reflection line, and it should be on the front of the jar, right here. So I want to make sure that that goes over the one apple. So I'll stamp that. There we go. Now I'll just remove that. And that's called masking. So now it looks like this apple is above that line, but you know, it's just a nice little technique. We'll set these stamps out of the way and remove our, oh, if I can close it, we'll remove our ink pads so we don't get anything in the way. Now what I'm going to do is bring in another scrap piece of paper. It's Very Vanilla, and I'm going to bring in the little nice fabric covered lid to our mason jar along with our Island Indigo ink. Just going to ink it up, stamp it down just like that, and then what I'll do is I'll cut around that. And I've already gone it ahead of time and done that, so there we go. Bring this little piece back in. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my 2.5 inch circle punch and I'm going to center my jar. Oh, looks like I got a little bit too much gap between me and the paper, so I'll cut some off. There we go, that's better. And it's okay that it's going to trim off some of the top of the mason jar because we're going to put this nice little cover on top of it. We're going to go ahead and take our sponge dauber and our early espresso ink pad. And we're just going to go ahead and sponge the edges of this circle. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some linen thread, I'm going to unravel a little piece. What it's going to do is it's going to go around the lid of the jar. And you're just going to tie a little bow, which depending on how your linen thread wants to cooperate, could be a little hard. But to get a good bow, what you want to do is you want to come from the string that you have on the bottom, you want to make a loop up. Your string from the top goes around that loop, then you go through the little hole, and when you go through that hole you bring through another loop. You're going to hold down the knot and pull on the tails. Then you're just going to pull on the loops to tighten. And just to adjust the size of your little loops, you just hold down on the knot and pull your tails until you get the size that you want. Just pull on your loops at the top again to tighten your little knot. So then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim the tails. And to make sure that my bow stays kind of where I want it, I'm just going to put a little dab of snail there and press it down. I don't need it to stay put, but I would like it to stay kind of in that area. Gonna flip it over and I'm going to grab a dimensional. And I'm going to cut it in half. And I'm going to put half of it below the thread and then half of it above. And I'm just going to go ahead and take it off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my little circle with the mason jar on it, and I'm just going to center the little lid where I want it and press down. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in my little piercing mat again. This time I'm going to bring in the little essentials plate that has the circle. I'm going to center the circle on my little circle cutout. Grab my paper piercer. And I'm going to pierce around the center, around the circle's edge. Now, whenever I get close to the jar, I'm going to stop because I don't want to go over the jar. And there we go. put my tool away. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some more dimensionals. I'm going to add them to the back of the circle. Set them aside. I'm going to bring back in my little base and grabbing my paper piercing stencil. I'm just going to start from the edge of the designer paper. Just going to bring it in and line it up with that black line using the sharp point of my Stampin' Right marker. I'm just going to draw a little line. And this is just to give it a little bit more detail because it's a very busy paper. But this little bit of stitching can make all the difference to it. We're gonna line that one up again. Make it a little bit darker. There we go. And you'll see that it just kind of, it can break up the paper just a little bit more. I'm gonna go ahead and put that cap back on. Take our little thing there and attach it. Now for the inside, I have a gotta get it out. Piece of Very Vanilla, and this Very Vanilla piece measures 4 inches by 5 1/4. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and go around the edge and just going to go ahead and sponge it. And I think that's all I'm going to do. You could stamp a little apple down here if you wanted to, but I think we're going to just leave it plain. I'm going to go ahead and attach some snail to the back. Bring in my card base. Center it on the inside. Lay it down. And that finishes off this card. I hope that you guys enjoyed the tutorial today, and thanks for stopping by.